Today we're going to explain the evidence and the subtle clues as to why Kirishima was the third user of One For All, and how by taking this power, it may have led to him suffering an unimaginable fate. Now, a couple of months ago, I posted a video explaining why Bakugo was the second user of One For All, and was flooded with comments specifically asking me if Kirishima could be the third. So this video will answer how and why that would be the case, as there have been little hints alluding to it that I'm going to take you through. However, if you've not seen that Bakugo video, then I'd recommend watching that before you watch this one, but for those of you who like to live life on the edge, let's get into it. We all know that One For All has a total of 9 permanent users, with Deku being the most recent. And in a recent chapter in the manga, some new information was revealed about some of the previous holders. For example, the fact that they didn't really have strong quirks and that they mostly died at a young age. But it was very interesting to note that 2 former users were not included in this conversation. Despite searching far and wide, All Might could find no information whatsoever on the second and third users, almost as if there was no existing records of them. And on top of that, they were both purposefully blurred out in previous chapters, and the placement of this speech bubble directly next to Bakugo is probably one of the least subtle hints that Horikoshi has ever given us. Like guys, the bubble is literally touching him, and look at what it says. All Might then goes on to say that All For One was obsessed with One For All and would seek to destroy anyone who possessed the power. And because One For All is a stockpiling quirk, its power is built up through the generations, with All Might being the first and only user of One For All to defeat him. Bearing that in mind, it was not the duty of the previous holders to defeat All For One, but rather, as it says in this panel, past users just had to make sure that their power would reach the future, where one day it would be strong enough to defeat him. The past users were not chosen ones, but rather they were the ones trusted by the previous holder. This ties into my Bakugo theory, as I mentioned that one of the reasons he was sent back in time was to ensure that One For All was created in the first place, thus ensuring that it reaches the future. And that's all well and good, but what next? Bakugo is many things, but immortal he is not. He knew that a time would come where eventually he would have to pass on the power, and it would have to be to someone he would trust. And as we saw at the battle in Kamino, there is no one he trusts more to get him out of a sticky situation than Kirishima. Bakugo needed someone he could trust to take the power, survive, and keep it safe in a world where All For One reigns supreme over Japan. And when looking at the third user in this flashback, it's pretty clear that he does have a very distinctive similarity to Kirishima, which a ton of you guys have mentioned to me in the comments. When you look at the shoulders of their respective hero costumes, let's not beat around the bush here. The gear shape is literally identical, and then let's also consider this other fact. Not only have we never seen another character with gears besides Kirishima, but we know that more than anyone else, the hero who he most aspires to be is Crimson Riot. You'd think that if Kirishima was going to copy someone, as far as his hero costume goes, it would be this guy, and not his great-great-great-grandfather, as I'm sure many of you are dying to tell me that this guy is. I got enough of those comments on the Bakugo video. Now, while this pineapple hair does look a little different to Kirishima's usual styles, it's not like every adult has the same hair they did when they were 14. And thanks to this artwork by Rodrigo Sani, we can easily imagine what Kirishima would look like if he had a hairstyle similar to this. And I gotta say, it doesn't look too out of place, but I know what you're thinking. Why would Kirishima even bother to go back in time when Bakugo was the one who was entrusted with ensuring that One For All was created? There are 2 possible answers to this question. So starting with the crazy theory, what if Bakugo traveled back to the past by himself and had spent his entire life in the past building up One For All, but at the end of it, he found no one he deemed worthy of taking on the power? Bakugo has high standards, guys, we know this. What if, in his time of need, Bakugo used One For All as a vehicle in which to send an Eren Yeager style message to the future, in which he tells the heroes that he needs a successor that he can trust before he dies of old age. So when Bakugo leaves this time transcending WhatsApp message inside One For All, this would find its way to Deku in the future, who would receive Bakugo's message in a vision or dream, quite similar to how we saw the memories of the first user of One For All. And after this, just like in Kamino, Deku would realize that the one person Bakugo would want to help him in this situation is Kirishima. And there's no way that the chivalrous hero, Red Riot, would turn down the call of his friend who is literally stuck in the past. Instead, he'd do the courageous thing and put his life on the line to ensure that One For All reaches the present day. And thanks to the beauty of time travel, Kirishima would appear in the past before Bakugo ever had the chance to die without having a successor. And yes, this is a paradox, but no more so than Bakugo being the second user was a paradox. It's basically like an infinite cycle. It just repeats and repeats and repeats. And it's hard to ascertain where it all originated from. That's the paradox, that we don't know what the quote-unquote first timeline is. But if that was all a little bit too convoluted for you, there's a far more simple possibility as to why Kirishima was the third user. What if Bakugo and Kirishima were sent back in time together in order to ensure that Bakugo could fulfill his mission, and perhaps to help him make more rational decisions when trying to convince the first user to pass on his quirk? In this scenario, things would be a bit different because they'd obviously age at the same rate because they went back in time at the same time. That would mean that when Bakugo becomes an old man, or if he becomes an old man, Kirishima would also be old as well. So the only way for Kirishima to get One For All in this scenario is if Bakugo, like most of the other users of One For All, is killed by All For One and passes the quirk on to Red Riot before he dies. And when you look at this panel of the previous users, it's basically a ritual at this point. If you look at the sixth holder, I mean, he's literally crying with his arm blown off as he's trying to pass on the quirk. Like, this quirk is cursed, guys. But moving on. We know that Deku will eventually get to use all the quirks of the previous users, which was one of the many benefits of Bakugo going back in time. And the same thing would apply to Kirishima's hardening quirk, as Deku could use it for the final battle with Shigaraki. Now in chapter 241 of the manga, Horikoshi put in a harmless joke, in which Kirishima said to Deku that he had mastered his hardening quirk after Deku was tensing up on stage whilst giving an interview. Now I'm not saying that this harmless one-off joke is evidence of something, but let's just presume that this theory about the second and third users being Bakugo and Kirishima, let's assume that it is actually planned out by Horikoshi. If that was the case, then panels like this and this are exactly the kind of subtle crumbs that an author who's thinking ahead would plant. Again, I'm not definitively saying that they prove anything, but it's just something to think about. Also, it'd be kind of handy for Midoriya to have these two quirks, as Bakugo says in this panel that the other users didn't really have good ones. And with that said, we've now explained what would have motivated Kirishima to become the third user, and we've also talked about the subtle hints that are alluding to the fact that Kirishima and Bakugo are the second and third users. So with that out of the way, I'm going to move on to my theory about Kirishima's horrific fate after taking One For All. And to do this, I want to briefly explain two things. Firstly, we now know that Nana Shimura's quirk was called Float, and it basically allowed her to hover in the air, as you would imagine. And this would usually be a pretty unspectacular piece of trivia until you couple it with the fact that we know All For One killed her, and in the present day we've seen him demonstrate the power to float. Now if this is her quirk, it shows that All For One has no problem harvesting the bodies of previous One For All users and then using it for whatever purpose that suits him. And with the evidence that we have at hand, All For One's levitation quirk was likely harvested from Nana Shimura's body. And I know that All For One calls this power Airwalk, but just remember guys, this is someone with infinite amount of quirks. We don't even know how many quirks he has, so he can combine various different quirks and then give them new names. It doesn't mean that he didn't take Nana Shimura's floating quirk. Secondly, it was also revealed in the manga that Kurogiri, who is one of All For One's most loyal and faithful disciples, is actually just a highly intelligent Nomu created from the body of a former UA student who was on the verge of death. After an accident, Shirakuma was believed to have died, but Dr. Ujiko somehow recovered his body before he actually did, and then took him to a hospital in the mountains. Whilst he was there, he turned Shirakuma into a living, almost like a robot, that loves All For One, blindly serves the League of Villains, and switches off when asked any questions that might incriminate All For One or Dr. Ujiko. This shows us many things. Number one, that Nomu can be programmed to genuinely have affection and love for All For One. Number two, they can look dramatically different from what we previously believed. Number three is that they can be intelligent and actually have long conversations. And number four is that they can be given quirks that aren't naturally occurring, but are rather a combination of previously existing quirks. And now guys, I'm going to tell you how everything I've just mentioned ties in together into the potentially horrible ending for Kirishima. I'll preface this by saying that I do not want this to happen, but let me know what you guys think. In the same way that they did this horrible stuff to Shirakumo, what if Kirishima was defeated by All For One and his half-conscious body was taken and experimented with? What if they tinkered with his body in such a way and tinkered with his mind in a way that they had never done before, almost like the first prototype for what was to come with Kurogiri many years later? What I'm suggesting, my friends, and I know this is a crazy theory, but hear me out. What if All For One's bodyguard, who has permanently hardened skin, spiked hair, and an unwavering loyalty to him, what if Gigantomachia is what's left of Kirishima? This would play even further into the concept of a time loop, and I'll show you what I mean. When Kirishima was a kid, he had an encounter with Gigantomachia that left him feeling frustrated, like he was unable to do anything, and he kind of felt like a coward. And in his frustration, he threw a book, which then accidentally activated an old hologram, which was an interview with his favorite hero. It was only after listening to this interview that inspired Kirishima to pursue his dreams of becoming a hero and attending UA, which he had previously given up on. It was only through seeing Gigantomachia and having those events occurred that led Kirishima to then become a hero and go to UA. And after succeeding in his goals, Kirishima would then become a pro hero, travel to the past, and become the third user of One For All. He would then be defeated by All For One and have his body and mind tinkered with until he literally became the creature known as Gigantomachia. He would then live on, and the cycle would then repeat itself again and again and again and again. Yeah, this is probably the darkest theory that I've ever come up with, but then again, All For One is just an awful guy. You can't say he wouldn't do this after what he's already done to Shirakumo and Nanashimura. Even Shigaraki, like he killed his grandmother. Nothing is beneath this guy. What if he took Kirishima's body and his hardening quirk and then built on top of that base by adding gigantification quirks and a lot of other quirks? It would just be so messed up, and I hope it doesn't happen, but hey, I'm just throwing the idea out there. If you look at him, the way his hard body is structured and the way the hair spikes out, I mean, he clearly wasn't born like that. This is someone who's been created in exactly the same way that Kurogiri was. And Gigantomachia does have multiple quirks, one of which could allow him to live for an indefinite period of time, just like All For One. But for those of you who have been paying close attention, you'll probably have one burning question. If Gigantomachia is still alive, then the vestige of the previous One For All user, who we're saying is Kirishima, surely that would be fiery as well, just like All Might's one is. And in reply to that, I would say, number one, well done for paying attention, and number two, we literally can't see the third user at all, like, he's completely blocked out. So maybe if we could see him, if Horikoshi would let us, maybe he would be fiery, who knows. But for whatever reason, Horikoshi thought it was better to have my guy as a black silhouette, where the only thing that you can really make out is his pineapple hair and his shoulder decorations. So as long as the third user remains blacked out like this, I'm just going to theorize what I want. But now that that crackpot theory is out of the way, let's move on to a reason why Kirishima actually might not be the third user. Now, whilst I haven't seen the new Heroes Rising movie yet, it's been reported that in this movie we get a good look at all the vestiges of One For All. And whilst the vestige that looks like Bakugo is covered in a red aura and has red eyes, which would be expected, the one that resembles Kirishima has a purple aura with yellow eyes. So the color scheme doesn't really match up here in the same way that Bakugo's does. You'd imagine that Horikoshi has big influence over the color scheme, as this was the first ever color representation of the previous users, like we'd never seen their auras before. Now the fact that the third user, who if it's Kirishima, his hero name is literally Red Riot, it'd be kind of weird that he doesn't have red anywhere, so it kind of makes it seem like it might not be him, but regardless, he may just be hiding it for another time. Be sure to let me